like to call the Rules and City Government special meeting to order. For the record, please note Alderman Arnett and Alderman Savage are in attendance, as well as Alderwoman Tierney and Alderman Payon. First item is approval of the agenda. I'll entertain a motion to approve the agenda as written.
I move approval of the agenda, but I think my colleague has.
Are you moving it as written or as amended?
Well, do we want to chat about that at all? 'Cause I think the latter two pieces of legislation will go a lot quicker than the maritime. I'm not sure we'll entirely finish the maritime today.
We're going to finish the maritime today. So that's my goal, as well as the other two pieces of legislation.
Okay.
This is our only opportunity before our next council meeting.
Okay, I will second the motion.
Okay, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, next item is approval of the minutes for the October 5th meeting.
Move approval of the minutes.
Second.
All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Okay, we have an appointment of Leona Totaski to the Civil Service Board. Is Ms. Totaski here, or?
No, Hillary said that she couldn't get in touch with her, and Hillary couldn't attend the meeting as well.
Or, I'm sorry.
She couldn't attend, and she didn't get in touch with the appointment.
Okay, then I think we should postpone the appointment. I'll entertain a motion to postpone the action.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Okay, first legislative item is O2521, Waterfront Maritime Zoning Districts uses. And it appears that we have a panel all prepared. So Dr. Nash or Ms. Fogarty, who's taking the lead on this?
We asked today the chair of the Planning Commission to join us, Bob Waldman, if you all have any questions regarding the Planning Commission amendments. We also have the chair of the Maritime Advisory Board, Terrence Lomax, and then from our task force, we have one of our co-chairs, Rod Jabin, who agreed to join us in the midst of the boat show, I might add, and then, of course, Dr. Nash, myself, and Eric Lashinsky.
Thank you for having us. Oh, okay. All right.
Excuse me. Okay, it appears we have 15 amendments to review today. I believe we have approved the first amendment or gave a favorable recommendation to Amendment 1.
Madam Chair.
You amended it.
So that became Amendment 10.
I think Jacqueline incorporated it into one, and kept it as amendment number 1.
Do we have a new copy of Amendment 1 then?
The one that I printed out should be the new copy, but I'll confirm with Jacqueline. It should be the updated version, the one that I printed out.
The one that's...
Where is that?
It's not printed out, it's on...
I printed it out for you, I believe, 1 through 9.
I have 1 through 5, 1 through 8. This is 3 through 8, I'm sorry. These are all in the order.
Yeah, I'm not
Get
finding
them out
them.
of order. 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. That's what these are. I'm looking for Amendment 1, or is it Amendment 10?
It's Amendment 1.
This is it.
What is it?
These are my notes. Where's the corrected copy? Do we have a corrected copy of Amendment 1? Do you, you
No,
the
I don't
same
have it
view?
either. I
Yeah.
have the same problem.
Okay, well, everybody does it. Is this the corrected copy in Granicus?
Sorry.
What?
It should be, but I'm gonna confirm with Jacqueline.
So where in Granicus?
It's attached in, as Amendment 1 through 9, is what I'm reading. Do you both have it?
I'm looking for it.
Which one are you asking about?
Amendment 1 takes place on page 3C, and according to my notes, we added under number 3, economic matters, which should be around line 5.
Yeah, I don't see, those aren't in here.
That's not the new one. She's gonna email it to me. She hasn't uploaded it.
So these are not, it's not added on,
No.
on this document. So we don't have Amendment 1.
She's gonna email it to me right now.
Okay, but we don't have it to act on it now. So let's go on to
Well, you already
Amendment.
acted on it.
We've already approved Amendment 1.
Yes,
Okay, but we just don't have a final copy of it.
right.
Okay. So we're going on to Amendment 2. And Amendment 2 is the Buckley-Tierney, one of the Buckley-Tierney amendments. Alderwoman Tierney, would you like to speak to what's happening in Amendment 2?
Yes, thank you. And let me just clarify, Amendment 1 will be revised, not the renumbering approach that we did last time. That's what you'll be looking at. So Amendment 2, the purpose of Amendment 2 is to adjust the calculations for water access. And this is basically establishing the denominator of the calculation. This one, I may need a little assist from Dr. Nash, because I don't see the reference in the Planning Commission recommendations for this, but I do see where it came from in the Maritime Report on page 17. The adjust calculations for the water access, I could not link that to, maybe Eric knows, I could not link that to the Planning Commission recommendations. The only language I saw comparable was on page 3, that all Tier 1 water access incentives shall be increased to 10% non-maritime uses, but there wasn't anything in the Planning Commission recommendations about the calculation. I'm sorry, are you on Amendment 2? I apologize. Okay, I apologize. I don't know if that was in the Planning Commission amendment, but this is just a correction. If we change it in one place, we have to change it in all the other places, is what this amendment is what we were saying we would do. Okay, so that's why I didn't see it in the Planning Commission report. There's language about providing the 150 parking spaces in the Planning Commission. So that's basically what it does.
Alderman Arnett?
So, Madam Chair, I believe part of our job is to not only look at the amendments offered by others, but to actually look at the legislation. And I have several concerns about this particular area of the legislation, the waterfront access incentives. And they deal mainly with the weights, some of the categories that are in here, but also the weights they're given. Now, hearkening back to the task force hearings, and I think I got to every one of them, but maybe one, and to the Planning Commission. The primary purpose of these incentives, it is to allow flexibility to the industry, but it's also to appeal to the people who live near the water and who visit the water. And I would argue that I'm on page 3, down at line 41, and I think this was brought to the Planning Commission's attention. I don't think the city should be getting a free slip from anybody. I think that if the city needs to have a slip, we should pay for it. So I don't agree with that as a water access incentive. And in fact, it isn't an access incentive for the residents and the visitors. On the water taxi landing, I think that is very valuable to the residents. And in fact, so valuable that I would certainly think that the weight of that, therefore the flexibility from that, should go up, in my mind, to 5%, not 1%. And remember, what we're trying to do here is to incent the property owners to provide these services. If we don't give them much of an incentive, then I don't think we're going to get much of a response. And I would certainly welcome input. I see property owners here, but to me, this is not actually providing an incentive to either the owners or an incentive to the community to be satisfied with this kind of flexibility. I would argue similar kinds of things for the public access for walking, but I think that is the piece of information that I passed out that I just received myself today about doing a definition for public water access and what it means is something that I would substitute in here for C, which is instead of public access for walking, I would substitute in public access these 4 different provisions that could satisfy public access. And again, I would give that a weight of 5, both as an incentive to the property owners to provide the incentive, but also as something that would appeal to the nearby residents and the people. And that's this document here that is untitled, mainly because I just got it a couple of hours ago. So,
Well, Alderman, let's be clear. You are opposing Amendment 3 for the purposes...
Amendment 3, no.
Or, I'm sorry, Amendment 2. We're on Amendment 2.
no,
Are you proposing that you amend Amendment 2 to include the percentages? You mentioned eliminating page 3, line 41, the city's own slip?
yes, that's the one where the fireboat resides. But I'm proposing that we give more weight to each one of these others. So the water taxi, the public access, but, oh, you probably don't have that over there. I think there's 2 copies, additional copies of this public water access on the table there.
We
in
were
front
on
of-
amendment number 2.
Possibly in front of you, I mean.
We were on
So
amendment 2.
this is work that was just recently, was submitted to me today and to others. And it has to do with some concerns when we get to Amendment 9 about properly defining public water access and protecting liability of the property owners. And so I know this is complicated, but these are the kinds of, in doing due diligence, the kinds of conversations I've been having with various people. And I think that the weights discussion of the actual categories here should precede discussion of amending the categories.
Alderman, I'm going to ask the chair of the committee if this was handled as part of your deliberations. and why your percentages are as you've outlined in Amendment 2. I assume that you concur with Amendment 2.
We concur with all of the amendments 1 through 9 that were submitted by Mayor Buckley and Alderwoman Tierney. In Amendment 2, the reference to the categories, and this is where the Planning Commission added an additional 5%, and their 5% was so that the very significant categories, such as on-site parking spaces, $125,000 for a street-end park, or community boating, that those facilities could go up to 10% because they're significant. The other facilities, the water taxi, public access, renting to tenants, all of that was intentionally considered to be a lower investment, and therefore they were associated with lower incentives. I did not see until later this afternoon, and Eric hasn't seen the modifications that it would be Chairman Waldman. Are these your modifications, or are these Ross Arnett's modifications?
It's a combination. I took what was given to me, which I think was perhaps came from Alderman Arnett, and read through them and tightened them up and clarified them and sort of integrated what was given to me to be consistent with what the Planning Commission really,
And so,
recommended.
if that's the case, what we would say for 1 through 4, they should not add up, because remember, people are able to cumulatively add these up. They should not add up to more than 5%. The older persons can attach, whether it's 1 or 2%, to each of these incentives, but the total should not exceed 5%. That would be what would be consistent with the plan.
Are you referring to the third amendment under Amendment 2? This doesn't have to be complicated if we can all
I was just given something that I think is from Alderman Arnett about public water access. That's what I'm referring to. And if the Planning Commission Chair finds it acceptable, then we would find it acceptable in terms of Alderman Arnett's questions about the percentages. The percentages should just not, if they are combined, exceed 5%, however the percentages are distributed.
Alderman Arnett, yours are not in the form of an amendment, so help me understand where they would fit within Amendment 2, because that is the topic of our discussion.
Well, Madam Chair, I think I would disagree with you. I think the topic of our discussion is the legislation that is before us. Some people have offered amendments, but part of our job is to review the legislation as offered. If you want me to wait until we go through the legislation, the amendments, and there's a whole bunch of them, including some others, for me, and then come back, but I feel that we, the council, and this committee in particular, need to discuss the content of the ordinance.
Alderman, I'm sorry. I understand what our role is very well, okay? The subject that we are discussing right now is Amendment Number 2. If you have other discussions about other things, that's fine, and we'll find a time to entertain those. Right now, we're dealing with these 15 amendments that are before us.
And
So
this,
we are not out of order.
I didn't say we were out of order, Madam Chair.
Well, but
I'm saying, though, that I would like the opportunity to discuss the legislation itself in addition to any amendments from others.
and I will grant you that opportunity,
All right.
but right now, we are going through these 15 amendments.
All right?
Alderman Savage?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So just on this amendment, let me see, the amendment. So I'm going to table the Arnett amendment for the moment. Amendment 2, I still, my biggest concern with this is still the 55%. That would be, what, about a 20% increase, I think, from the existing? Eileen, Ms. Fogarty? Ms. Fogarty?
Yes,
So that'd be a 20% increase. Currently, WMM is 35% max, is that right?
the current
married.
is
30.
30. With the fifth in WMM, it's 30. It would go to 45 without any water access. Currently, it would go to 50 with water access. As written, the amendment from the Planning Commission was to take that to 55. In the other districts, in WME and WMI, they are at 0. So they would go from 0 to 15 with the incentive for the land-intensive large boat yards. They would then, in theory, be able to go to 20% with the water access incentive. This would enable them, the Commission's amendment would enable them to go to 25%. In reality, I don't think there is an expectation that most of those boat yards will use the water access incentive because of the conflicts.
Yeah. So, again, that's kind of, my concern is that 20%, so you're saying it's currently 30%. We'd be approving, the ordinance as written would be a 20% increase up to 50. As amended, it'd be 25%. That's still a pretty sizable increase. And for me, it's also large. It's also, it's not symbolic, but it's really gets to the heart of this, because that's the line we cross. If we cross that 50% line, it ceases being a maritime zoning. It becomes commercial zoning with a maritime component. And so, I've heard some compelling reasons to go up to 55, but that's my main concern. And I think starting with 20% is reasonable, and we'll see how it goes in the future if we need to increase it. But my other issue is that that was the percentage that was developed from the consensus of the overall task force, and I just don't think we should be so quick to move beyond that unless we have a really compelling reason. If my colleague from Ward 8 thinks it's really important for his ward to go up to 55%, I'll abstain, but that's kind of where I am right now with this amendment. The others, for the most part, are fine by me, but this one gives me some heartburn.
Well, Alderman, is that a motion?
I'm not quite ready to make a motion on it, but on the amendment.
So there is no motion on Amendment 2.
Madam Chair?
Okay.
Well, I'll make
Alderman
a,
Tierney-
I
I'm
think,
sorry.
I'll make a, well, I'd like to hear before I make a
Well,
motion.
we should have a motion on the floor before we
Yeah.
continue discussion on it. So if you'd like to make a motion. Alderwoman Tierney, you had your.
yeah, this is, as I said when we started talking about amendment number 2, this is the only amendment I had difficulty marrying up with the Planning Commission recommendations. And this specific page 3 from 50% in the WMM going from 50% to 55%. I don't want to put you on the spot, but could you help me out on where that came from? Everything else is from the Planning Commission report, but this, there's broad language about incentivizing up to 10%, but I did not see this addressed specifically. So your concern is warranted, is what I'm saying. Okay.
Right, and I apologize, I think you were asking me that earlier, and I didn't answer the right question.
Okay.
So if you go to the Planning Commission findings.
Yep.
On page 3.
Yep.
If you read B, it's talking about giving More non-maritime flexibility to owners, increasing category 2 incentives to 10%.
Correct. I saw that.
That is how you get to the extra percentage. Because it adds,
So
What page? Could you say that again?
page 3 of the Planning Commission findings.
at the top.
B, yep. Increasing category 2 incentives to 10%. That's what takes you to the 55, because right now it is 5%. So 50 plus 5, 55. And for category 2, the percentages are additive, and there's no cap. Whereas in category 1, there's a cap. Uh-oh, Cardi's making noise. Okay, no, I'm sorry, there is a cap. There's,
There is a total cap of 10%. The total cap previously was 5%, so there is a total cap of 10%.
So we basically have to trust the math here, is that, I think that's what we're saying. Okay. And to Alderman Arnett's concern, this is all working off of the assumption that you agree with the legislations, because the first one is basically a wording correction to align with the base legislation.
correct.
Yeah.
And the basic structure of how we've laid out the incentives and allotted the percentages.
Correct. And I don't know if there was any problem with the other two.
Well,
Alderman Arnett?
thank you, Madam Chair. Look, this is a very complicated piece of legislation with lots of moving parts. This is the first time the council has had an opportunity to weigh in the body of this committee. And I am trying to find a way to get comfortable with the recommendations of these amendments. And I share Alderman Savage's concern. Right now, I'm not comfortable with any zone going over 50% non-maritime. Having said that, I would quickly interject, but I can become comfortable with that. There's ways I can become comfortable with that. And as you have now ruled, when the time comes, I will like to go back to this section of the legislation, not the amendment, and talk about things that I think we can do to make that happen. But I'm going to follow your lead on how we go. Right now, I'm not ready to vote for Amendment 2, even though there's much of it that I agree to.
Alderman, our process is if there is something that you would like to change in the course of any legislation before us, then you bring forth an amendment. And that amendment will be evaluated and voted on in support of or not. So I would ask you to prepare your amendments, and I know we only have today, but we have been working on this for some time. We've heard from the committee a number of times. We still have questions, absolutely, but we have to follow a process, and we cannot stop it. So if there is no motion on supporting or opposing Amendment 2, then we will not take a position on Amendment 2, and we will move on. Alderman Savage?
I will move unfavorably for Amendment 2.
Okay, then I will second that motion. Further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of support of Amendment 2, please say aye. Aye.
Of a unfavorable recommendation?
Did you give it a favorable or unfavorable?
I said unfavorable.
Unfavorable, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. Okay, so the motion on the floor is to give an unfavorable recommendation. And I'm going to rescind my second on that because I still have concerns, but I'm going to let us move forward. So we do not have a position on Amendment 2. Okay.
Well, so you are not seconding it. I will second the
Okay.
unfavorable recommendation.
Okay. So it is seconded. Further discussion?
Again, I would say that I think we can make this better, but we'll plow through the 9 recommendations. I would like to reserve the right to go back and talk about the legislation itself, not the amendments.
Alderman, did I not say
Yes, I
10
know.
minutes ago that we were going to do that? So we will. All in opposition to Amendment 2, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Moving on to Amendment 3. Alderwoman Tierney?
Sure.
That is also one of your amendments?
Yeah, I have the Planning Commission recommendations and amendments. Number 3 is in the spirit of the study as far as providing continuation of community benefits. The Maritime Study speaks to that on page 27. Again, there's not an absolute link to the Planning Commission recommendations here that I saw, but it is strongly stated in the Maritime Study the importance of community benefits. Does Dr. Nash want to add anything, or?
Can I get a motion? Alderman Arnett?
I'll move favorably, but I would like to ask a question.
Second.
Okay. Go ahead.
I'd really like to have an understanding, throughout the legislation, we swing back and forth between August 24th of 1987 and as of the effective date of the ordinance. I'm sure there's a reason why you made those recommendations, but it's not clear to me what you see as the impact to be achieved by changing it to the effective date.
In general, when you do legislation, you bring it up to the effective date of the ordinance. We specifically did not do that with the residential units being constructed in the districts, because we were and that was a very conscious decision to not make conforming units that had been constructed since 1987. But I believe in all the rest of the places, other than that, we just made everything current.
I'm not sure I understand still. So we're on page 5, line 37. When we say that it is effective with the passage of the ordinance, as opposed to leaving it at the August 24th date in 1987, what does that mean? What happens because we've changed the effective date?
What line did you say?
We're on page 5 of the ordinance, first reader version, and this is referring to line 37, and it's adding the clause, any community benefits, specifically parking required by the business plan development. Great with that. But then it says on page 26, page 6, line 25, we're striking uses deemed conforming. We're changing that from uses deemed conforming, I believe effective on August 24th, 1987, to saying effective with the date of the passage. This deemed conforming has been a controversial thing. I'm really just trying to understand what it means by changing the effective date. Does that include all new buildings that have occurred between August 24th, 1987 and whenever we pass this?
Well, I believe, and I may not have been clear in what I just said, but the intent was for residential to keep the date as 1987, not to move the date up, and that is what this does.
If I may.
You're right. I missed the fact that we're striking that out of, all right, I understand, and I'm ready to vote.
Further discussion? Hearing none, all
Can
in
I-
favor?
May I, can I just make one clarification, just to be clear that in the comment in Amendment 3, where we refer to specifically parking, we want to clarify that the parking that is continued through the community benefit agreement, any community benefit agreement, would be the same parking that could count towards water access incentives. So that, just to be clear there.
Right.
Thank you. So I'll call the question. All in favor of Amendment 3, please say aye.
Aye.
Going on to Amendment 4, Alderman Tierney, page 12, line 22. Your amendment also. Excuse me?
Sorry, I wasn't on mic. This is a relatively easy one. Continued protection of the 100-foot waterway. This was a strong recommendation in the Planning Commission report, page 6. I can read to you. Recommendation: no new non-maritime construction shall be allowed within 100 feet of the water line. And unless corrected otherwise, that's the intent of this amendment. And Eric is shaking his head.
Madam Chair, can I move a favorable recommendation?
Second?
Okay, further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of Amendment 4, please say aye.
Aye.
Amendment 5. Alderwoman? Is that yours also?
Yeah. Okay, amendment number 5, the objective is, this is where we're going to get into calculations again, and stipulating the gross area as the denominator is the building and not the lot. This is coming from what I gather, unless corrected otherwise, is the language in the Planning Commission that addresses, well, there's a few parts to this. Yeah, the biggest part of this is the first part is correcting the language on the calculation as far as the gross area. And it appears to me to align with the base legislation. And the last part is to set up the fee, which is another strong recommendation from the Planning Commission. You might want to discuss these separately. And I think this is when I just have to make a general statement that, and I think I said this last time, the general thrust of the Planning Commission's recommendations is water access and to incentivize as much as possible to gain water access. I think every one of these amendments addresses that. Dr. Nash, do you want to add anything on Amendment 5? Sure.
The calculation, while it sounds arcane, what it is on some of the existing sites in WMM, they are calculated based on development lot. So we did not want to disincentivize the existing sites, so we kept that in for the properties existing as of the date of adoption of this ordinance, but anything new, any of the new 15%, we clarified throughout all the districts that it is only based on the building, not the lot. So it's a clarification.
Which typically is the practice. You know, when you talk about use, it's the building, the usable area.
Okay, do we have a motion? Alderman Savage?
I'll move it favorably for the sake of discussion.
Pardon me?
I'll move it favorably for the sake of discussion.
I have a,
I'll second it.
okay, I would, yes. So again, to the staff, and I'm looking at page 12 of the first reader of the ordinance. Can you please tell me, starting at line 35, what is the effect of Amendment 5 on the maximums? So it says WMM maximum 50% in conjunctions with trigger and access. Now, it's always hard to know. In the case of 50%, it means 50% maritime, 50% non-maritime. But when you go into any other number, we need to know, is this, so for example, in the WME, 20%, that's the maximum flexibility in the WME with triggers and incentives.
That's correct.
And what this would do, if I'm understanding the amendment correctly, would be to change line 35 to a maximum of 45% in conjunction with triggers and maximums. And the problem is 45% maritime or 45% non-maritime. There's no modifier in the table to let you know. If you could read it in the WME, it's 20% non-maritime. In the WMI, it's 20% non-maritime. So if we change these numbers, and I think these numbers would change to 45, 25, and 25, is that with the Planning Commission amendment?
I think the only issue that the Rules Committee would have is looking at the amendments, page 4, under Amendment 5, page 4F, the first bullet, that is where it goes to 55% to reflect the Planning Commission's 10% incentive. And from what the Rules Committee has just said, you would want that to read 50%. You would not want that to be 55.
In the WMM.
So,
In the WMM, yes, I think the rest of it is all consistent.
well, on page 4 of the amendments, in D,
Next page, flip it over. Where your thumb is.
Oh, oh, here, okay.
So,
The non-maritime, right, okay. So I can't quite figure out how, on page 4, what's written in C and D relates to then on page 5, under F. I'm just having a hard time translating that because there's no modifier to these percentages. Already has her hand up.
I'm sorry, Ms. Stumpton,
Let me just,
could you be on a mic, please?
I mean, I just, Alderman, if I understand your comment, I mean, the only thing in this amendment that is a substantive change is what Ms. Fogarty just said, the 55% is changing the non-maritime in the WMM from the 45, from the 50% total that was in the first reader. So
And that
Are you on your
takes us-
mic? Is your mic on?
it is, so I'm not
That
speaking
takes
into
us
it.
back to Amendment 2, where we were having this.
That's
same-
right. That is
same
consistent with Amendment 2, and that's why we felt that, you know, that.
And it was the task force that said 50%, as is in the legislation. It's the Planning Commission that wants to raise that.
Correct, and the other amendments under Amendment 5, C and D, are basically, again, clarification definitions. In D, we reinforce that residential uses will not be counted toward the base calculation. And then there's the fee. So the only thing of substance is F, the first bullet, and I believe you all disagree based on, or do not concur with the 55, from your perspective, based on what you have said this afternoon, you would want that to be 50?
At this point, yes, later on will have. Well, yes,
So what, Alderman Savage?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Just, how would you like to handle this? If I or we wanted to make a motion to basically move this amendment with 50% instead of 55, how would you want me to make that?
Well, if the maker of the motion will accept that as a friendly amendment, then we can do that very easily.
Yeah.
Alderwoman Kearney?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think the stickler I'm hearing very strongly is the WMM going from 50 to 55. So we perhaps could even go to Amendment 2 and partially favorably, because this amendment possibly could have been broken up, because I don't, the first part was the clarification of calculating maritime use, so the numerator denominator thing. And then, but the other part of it is the fee, which will be supported, will come before the city council, proposing a maritime fund fee, which was a strong recommendation by Mr. Waldman on the Planning Commission. And then F is the percentages of which
Party's point is
the stickler is the WMM, going from 50 to 55. So
Alderwoman, is that a yes?
it's a yes. I just didn't want you to miss the part about the maritime fund fee. So yes.
And we also have a question, oh, I'm sorry, from Mr. Waldman.
Alderman Payon?
Thank you. My question, I suppose, is somewhat rhetorical, but what difference does it make if it's 50 or 55? Is it that big a deal one way or the other?
Are you asking me?
Anybody?
Well,
Go ahead.
for me, if it isn't 50% maritime, it's not maritime. It's something else. So it's non-maritime. Now, I know I'm upsetting some people in the room. When we get back to after going through these amendments, I do have some fixes that I would like to propose that can make me comfortable with that. But for now, All right. These are the maritime services that I use as a mariner. And to have them go below 50% maritime.
You're getting a little bit muffled. I can't.
Okay. Suffice it to say, I think that just like, do you consider the WMC maritime anymore? We don't even treat it.
Okay.
The Maritime Task Force didn't treat it because it's not
Just
50%
asking.
maritime.
All right. Thank you.
Mr. Waldman, did you have a question?
A
Or
comment,
an answer?
an explanation perhaps. The Planning Commission looked at the 3 zones that are under consideration and saw that 2 of them, WMI and WME, are quite different from WMM. And I hope that we made ourselves clear that only in the WMM would that percentage rise above 50%. And the reason for that, there were several, but one of them is that there's a considerable amount of parking available in one of the 3 major properties in WMM, and that providing a huge incentive for them to go beyond that 50% to make that shared parking available to residents and tourists and whomever was worth it. And that it wouldn't change the character of WMM. I hope I've made myself clear.
I think we need a map.
Only in that zone that would arise above 50% in any way, shape, or form.
Okay, thank you. Well, the motion on the floor has been amended to change the 55% back to 50%, and it's been accepted as a friendly amendment to amendment number 5. Further discussion? Hearing none. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Okay, amendment number 6.
Okay, this is all about water access at the new restaurants, increasing the water access. It's asking the restaurants to provide water access, and it also adds the definition of that. And it is on the first page of the Planning Commission report. And for strong language, if I may quote the Planning Commission recommendation, that public access should be mandatory when there are restaurants or other non-maritime retail open to the general public.
Alderman Arnett?
Recommend we move favorably, but then I have discussion.
Second.
Okay, it's been properly moved and seconded. Discussion, Alderman Arnett?
So one of the questions when we go through the legislation itself and here with the amendment is what is the definition of public water access? And that's a very critical issue, and that is why, and I only got this today, which is why I'm offering it today. This was a definition of what public water access means. And it means any one of the four: a water taxi, pick up and drop off, a walkway with a bench or area from which the public may view the water, a location for launch and recovery of paddlecraft, or for crabbing and fishing. And then it goes on with other clarification. And I think that, and I will move that we have this added to the definition section of Title 2172. And then that makes this reference to public water access clear. We don't have a definition otherwise, and so
We
I think
do in
that's a
Amendment
critical-
9.
Pardon me?
I will make a proposal that we create Amendment 16,
Okay,
and this becomes it, and it's an
That's
insert in definitions.
thank you.
Alderman Tierney?
No, I just said there's additional clarification on water access in Amendment 9, but that's fine.
Okay, right now we're on Amendment 6.
Correct.
And so there's been a motion to give a favorable recommendation. Hearing no further discussion, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, Amendment 7. Alderwoman Tierney.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is a very important point. This in the WME, which is, we probably should have a map. I'm assuming you all know the different maritime areas, but WME is
I have a map that I can put up here.
yeah, because that was, probably should have been brought up when we were talking about WMM, because it's a bigger area, so. Anyways, this limits the restaurant square footage in WME, which is alongside Spa Creek, to 2,000 square feet. And that is a recommendation from the Planning Commission, page 4, that states that as well, the WME zone shall be limited to restaurants of no more than 2,000 square feet. And it goes on to explain no rooftop dining, et cetera, no amplified music. And I want to say I support this as well, being alderman of Ward 1, looking across over to it and the effect it would have on the residents across Spa Creek.
All right, further discussion?
Yep, and that's what we're talking about here. WME.
I'll move a favorable
Savage?
recommendation.
I'm sorry?
I'll move a favorable
I'm
recommendation.
sorry, and I was thinking we had already done that before our discussion. Alderman Arnett, are you seconding
Yes.
that? Okay.
Yep.
Alderman Schnellmeyer?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I know I'm not part of the committee. This does actually, but I do want to point out this does fly against one of my amendments, which is actually to expand this. I think that putting in special exceptions for different areas is, for the different areas that are right next to each other on something like restaurant size, is a bit arbitrary. I will say, as far as noise complaints goes, a 2,000 square foot restaurant and a 4,000 square foot restaurant can both produce the same amount of noise. I've worked in restaurants of both sizes for years, as you guys know. I do think I think the differentiate put in is a bit arbitrary. So I would personally recommend an unfavorable recommendation on this, but it is your committee.
Further discussion?
So the resolution speaks to special exception. It happens that it's 2,000, it happens there's an amendment to make it 4,000. In either case, the special exception process allows the community a process whereby they can offer input. And we use the special exception process throughout Title 21, and I think it is appropriate here. And that's why I move that we vote favorably on this amendment.
So the motion on the floor is to give a favorable recommendation
Correct.
for number 7. Further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Okay, amendment number 8. Alderwoman Tierney.
Okay, this one I might need to call a friend. My understanding of the first part of Amendment 8, not the maritime fund fee, but the first part is subsequent clarification of the use on gross floor area versus lot, and that is in line with the previous amendment. Is there anything we need to add to that, Dr. Nash?
Before Dr. Nash speaks, could I get a motion?
I'll move a favorable recommendation.
Second.
Okay, now discussion. Thank you. Dr. Nash?
Thank you. Do you want to?
This is completely consistent with the prior actions. It's in the law's office drafting, there are different locations that the same text appears.
So I would just add that in the legislation, we have a section for professional office use, and we have a section for non-maritime retail. This is, they both have similar clarifications. This is the section on non-maritime retail. An earlier amendment focused on the professional office.
Okay.
For Alderman Savage, then Alderman Arnett.
I don't have any further questions on this. I'm fine with this itself. It's still, again, the 50% versus 55% that I would ask if that would be a friendly amendment or not. I mean, I'm generally, there have been some good arguments made, I think, for the 55, but again, I just think we're creating a slippery slope, and we're already seeing amendments that would increase it well beyond even 50, and I just think we should see how this works.
Alderwoman Tierney, would you accept, and I assume you're talking about the third paragraph of the amendment where it speaks to 15% of the gross floor area?
Yeah, and the
Fourth paragraph.
Page 17, is that what you're?
Yes.
For,
Page 17, line 10.
for the.
And you would want that to be what percentage?
remain 50.
To basically take out those two sentences, so it'll remain at 50%.
Yeah, and I have no problem with
So
that.
it would remain as what?
50%.
50%?
Yes,
As it is in the original legislation.
as introduced.
Alderwoman Tierney, are you clear on what?
Yeah,
he's
I'm very
asking?
clear, and I have no problem with that. It's, the maritime study itself is very adamant about the 50%. Again, the purpose of this was to incentivize water access. So you win some, you lose some, okay, right? I mean, I agree, yes.
So you would accept that is what you're
Yes.
saying? Okay. Further discussion? Alderman Arnett.
I would just add, with those changes, and I will be coming back to it, but there's a lot of other very good stuff in here, particularly the amendment on page 6, which I strongly endorse. So I will be with.
Page 6 or 16?
16, sorry. with this friendly amendment, I'm certainly inclined to vote yes.
Okay, further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of Amendment 8, please say aye.
Aye.
And going on to Amendment 9. Ms. Alderwoman?
Yeah, these are providing definitions as requested from the Planning Commission report. And we can go through each, but the big, I brought up this before, there is a clarification on public water access. I'm not sure if that would classify as a definition on page 21 after line 20.
I move
Motion, I'm
favorable.
sorry.
Move favorable recommendation.
Moved by Alderman Arnett, second
Second.
by Alderman Savage.
Could I?
Alderman Savage?
Thank you, Madam Chair. My only comment on this is, well, two questions. One of them would be on the ADA, because it says that, so if you're looking on Amendment 9, the second paragraph from the bottom, it says, public water access means, and it goes into the definition, it says that it may be used for leisure activities, which is my other question, what's leisure activities? And then allowed by law and must be ADA compliant. And my concern is that what part of it would have to be ADA? Because as we're learning from the whole crab proposal, ADAs kind of need a lot of, it might be tricky to make all of our access ADA compliant, especially, I'm thinking just, probably a bad example, but Wells Cove, if we were to make that, if we actually were to make that public access, we may not have room to put in a whole ramp to get down to a dock, and you'd have to have an ADA compliant dock. So I don't know. I mean, I understand and support the idea of making things ADA compliant, but my concern is just the size, because some of these are not that big. So would we, essentially, by having this in there, would we be preventing ourselves from ever having public access? Is my
Yeah,
point.
I think you make a good point there. I mean, the intent was clearly to expand access, to as many users as possible. There will be some locations certainly that are going to be challenging, and I know that making our paddle access docks ADA compliant is one of the most challenging things I think the city is dealing with right now. So
Well, could
may
we
be a
put
better
in
way.
a sentence that maybe, even if we just say after must be ADA compliant, could we just put something that says where feasible, or
Within site constraints. Within site
that's good. Within
constraints.
site constraints, something like that.
Mr. Nolan, if you could step to a mic. Yeah. Please.
Yeah, on this issue, just a little practical.
Would you make sure it's on?
This issue is, there's some practical considerations. And for instance, at Annapolis City Marina, the ramp, driving ramp from the first level to the second level parking-wise, I can tell you it does not meet ADA requirements because it's too steep. There's no way to go back and change that parking ramp. And so there are some, by making this ADA reference, you're really creating a can of worms that I don't think can be met. And that's a practical problem for a lot of the properties, because ordinarily that would not be a consideration. But by putting that ADA reference in, it's going to become virtually an impossibility. Just by way of example, I think the intent is to have access to the water. And for instance, at Annapolis City Marina, we already have that. But to throw the ADA reference in is just going to create a legal impossibility.
So do you think by adding the language where possible or where feasible would not? address?
As a lawyer who does a lot of drafting of contracts and other things, I think that's a total can of worms. Try to figure that out would be very, very difficult.
Alderman Arnett, and then Alderman Tierney.
Mr. Nolan, are we not required by the federal ADA code, though, to, I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I agree with Alderman Savage's question, and I would also point out it's in the alternate language that I'm proposing. But do we have a choice?
I think in the context of what 02521 does, I think the answer is yes. I don't think you have to add it. The property has to meet whatever ADA requirements it's required to meet. I'd suggest it does, but I think by tying it into 025, when you're trying to simply cover access to water, in the case of Annapolis City Marina, I'm giving you an example of, we're talking about parking, getting from one parking level to another. It has to meet whatever the requirements are. But whether or not that is strictly ADA compliant in terms of what you're talking about here, I'm not so sure. I think it just creates a potential can of worms here that is the old unintended consequence that people talk about. That's the concern.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Alderman Tierney.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can I make a proposed revision? Okay, I'll make a proposed revision. I would propose that we rephrase it to say a waterway that may be used for leisure activities allowed by law and within existing site parameters, period.
Would you repeat where you would like that language to go?
I'm rephrasing on page 21 after line 20, the sentence that begins with a waterway that may be used for leisure activities allowed by law, which would cover ADA by inference. Don't type that. Required by law, and within existing site constraints or parameters, Rob? Constraints. I'm thinking of crab.
I didn't get that. Ms. Green, did you get?
Well,
No, because she changed it.
Within,
the first time.
within existing, yeah, within existing site constraints instead of parameters.
So you're on page 21, line 20, and after the first sentence, you are adding, am I in the right place?
I'm replacing,
And I'm going to ask Ms. Green to repeat that for us.
a waterway that
Okay, so the first time, you didn't change anything until you got to
allowed by
activities allowed by law and within existing site constraints. period.
correct, period.
But
Did you
the
guys
second
get that?
time,
no,
Okay.
you changed
but this is why I want to substitute this in.
line 2, so
Is
I'm
that
not
in
sure.
there?
Are you
It's-
changing any
no,
wording?
No, the first time you got it right.
Okay.
The leisure.
It actually,
activities allowed by
replaces
law.
that sentence.
That's one of the things that people have raised.
Okay, then you need to make this another.
Yeah.
Madam Chair, may I?
I'm sorry, Alderman Savage. We didn't get the,
Well, I was gonna, can I suggest, I was gonna make a suggestion.
could I have Ms. Green read it again loudly so everybody can hear it, and then we can discuss it?
Okay, so it's on page 21, after line 20, insert public water access means the right for the general public to access by foot an area fronting a waterway that within existing site constraints. period.
No,
What, page 21?
I'm,
In that paragraph,
No, I'm
right after
amending
the
the
first sentence, I think.
No, I don't.
It is, it's that page.
Is
No,
it in
no, no,
this?
that's not the same page. It's on page
This is page 21.
He's on
Where are your amendments?
Oh, so you're talking about the amendments, not
Yes,
the.
we're on amendment number 9, page 21, which is that section.
Yeah.
So
And we-
that neighbor's usual activities allowed by law and within existing site constraints. Let's cross that out. Yeah, cross out too much. Neighbor's usual activities stays.
I'm going to ask if we, Alderwoman, this is your amendment, so you can make all the changes you want.
Yeah,
I would,
it's very simple. Let me just mark it with my left hand.
I'm going to ask that you have Ms. Green type it up and give us a copy of it, because it's not as,
Within existing site constraints.
I'd like to postpone action on this amendment, and come back
Could I
to it after.
make a suggestion, if Alderman Tierney is okay with it?
Sure.
You could just put a period after "as required by law," because you can get waivers to ADA in certain situations.
Yeah, I was trying to address lessons learned from the Crabble experience and address existing site constraints, which was an issue. On
But that would be
Crabble site,
taken
but
into
that's-
consideration if they needed an ADA
So-
waiver,
Yeah, so less is
just for
more.
the sake of simplicity.
Yeah, okay, let's just delete that.
So Dr. Nash, could you tell us, can you repeat that? Where are we, what are
So-
we eliminating and where are we putting the period after?
I'm on Amendment 9, page 6, down at the bottom. So it says, "Public water access means the right for the general public to access by foot an area fronting a waterway that may be used for leisure activities allowed by law, period."
Period.
So, and your justification for that is the law already requires ADA compliance, so we don't need the rest of it.
Right, unless you're eligible for a waiver based on site conditions.
Okay.
Correct.
Does it then
Mr.
go on to public water access does not require? Or are you dropping everything after? Oh, okay.
Just,
All right.
Mr. Dale?
Thank you, Chair Finlayson. Phil Dalesworth, Walsh and Simmons. I was going to speak to the same issue that Dr. Nash spoke to, in that there are often waivers available, and those are necessary to make ADA compliance practical. In a lot of situations, we deal with downtown Annapolis and existing buildings, older buildings. The one issue I would additionally ask you to consider is if we just say by law and therefore, or thereby refer to the ADA, we may also just remember that in some of these cases, public access may not relate to a building, something ordinarily governed by the building code that provides for those waivers. So by law and customary permitting practices or the city's enforcement practices may be additional language that helps us get to those waivers and the already practiced enforcement for ADA compliance.
So Dr. Nash's recommendation would be in line with what you're,
It is. I would just say maybe we consider additional language to refer to the city's enforcement practices so that we can make sure that those waivers apply to things like ramps and features of a site that are not explicitly buildings governed by the building code. Because my point is, and Dr. Nash could confirm, that the building code is where you find many of those waivers, and the building code may not always be applicable to the public access we're thinking about here.
Dr. Nash, is there,
That is true. I just hate to make it more complicated than it needs to be. I feel like it's okay with the period after law. I think the intent is clear. But I'm not married to it if you want to add additional language.
One suggestion might be, and in general accordance with the requirements of the law.
Could I move the Dr. Nash period?
okay, well, I'm going to go back to the maker of this amendment. I was just trying to get all the discussions in. Mr. Lomax, I think you had your hand up.
I just want to make the point that actually 2172.010 is very limited. It only goes to the standard for restaurants in 2164.540. It is not a broad brush application. If you go back to 2164.540, you'll see that it says, you'll provide public water access in accordance with 2172.010. And so the definition is only going to apply when you have a restaurant use, and as part of that use, you have to provide some sort of public access. It's not across-the-board public access that we've been talking about, or you all have been talking about over the course of the day. And I think that's because of that limitation, the language that Alderman Arnett has makes clear as to what constitutes that public access, as opposed to just leisure activities or specific items that the restaurant could provide. And so it's a little bit the cart before the horse, because I don't think that amendment's been introduced, but it actually clarifies a lot of these issues, except the ADA issue, which is the same language as in there now. That's all.
This is our general terms, so it would apply generally to public water access. I think your point is well taken that future Amendment 16, if you recommend future Amendment 16, you don't really need this part of Amendment 9.
Yes.
Alderman Arnett?
So I do have two questions on Amendment 19, although I'm largely in favor of it, but...
You mean 9?
9, sorry. But I do want to know, what does the clause, leisure activities allowed by law? Is there a delineation now that's required for leisure activities allowed by law? I mean...
Did you say no skinny dipping? That's what I was thinking. I don't know what you said.
I was thinking smoking a joint, but...
You don't usually do that in the water, though, do you?
Who knows?
I don't know. I'm sorry. Off topic, sorry.
The intent was to just provide a broad reference to city policies, other policies that may govern land use, in this jurisdiction. But
all right. Well, I think if we get to my Amendment 16 to replace this language and to make it more generic replacement, that kind of goes away. But my other question about Amendment 19 is back up towards the top, this amendment on page 20, line 18, recreational boating clubs and offices. What are those? And I know on the dock at Muller Marine, there's a Catalina Boat Club, or there used to be anyway, and it was 2 boats, and it was a Catalina club, and it would potentially qualify as recreational boating clubs and offices. When we go down and look at the definition of yacht clubs, I mean, that's a much bigger thing. So are we opening this up to say that any 2 people could come along and declare themselves a club and therefore qualify under this amendment? What exactly do we mean by recreational boating clubs, and what if they don't have an office?
yeah, the intent was to clarify that this is a distinct use from the sailing clubs, which has a much more, the requirements to meet that use are stronger in terms of the number of boats and members, and we felt that there are instances of uses that are much more informal boating access and rentals and boat sharing and so forth.
And Alderman Arnett, this is not a trigger for anything. This was just in the definitions of all of the types of activities.
That's right. The sailing clubs are a trigger, so that's
Okay, and
we wanted to
that's
distinguish.
fine. I'm just trying to understand. So would a maritime service organization include recreational boating clubs, or is that something entirely distinct? And I realize this is in the definition section, it's not a trigger, it's not, but still, we are putting it in the code. So it does feel to me like it needs some kind of description and some kind of boundaries. I mean, if two people get together and say we're a club and they have a boat at a slip, is that a recreational boating club? As opposed to like the J boats at the, down again on Back Creek, that is a club, and they have Allbergs and J boats that you can rent. And you have a membership and you pay monthly. So I thought it was a little ambiguous.
It was just supposed to be an example, but it can be taken out if you prefer.
Well, I just wanted to know what it was and why we were putting it in. Other than that.
It is intentionally broad, so, I mean, if you think it's.
Okay.
Okay, we have a motion on the floor to approve Amendment 9. And Alderwoman Tierney, as the maker of this amendment, you've accepted your own amendment, correction to your amendment.
Yeah, that's correct. I want to reiterate what Mr. Womack said, that this is specifically addressing water access, so we don't need to pigeonhole any other definitions for ADA compliant. So, yes.
Okay.
I think
So hearing no further discussion, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Thank you.
Okay, that takes us to Amendment 10.
Excuse me, Chairwoman, I'm wondering if Amendment 2, because there were two aspects of Amendment 2 which it sounded as though the Rules Committee did not agree with, and that was the 55% and the 10%, but the rest of Amendment 2 was technical language that the law office felt needed to be in that category.
Then I'll defer to the sponsor of this amendment.
Thank you so much.
To make the necessary corrections.
Yes, I would like to refer back to Amendment 2 and sort of take it apart and relook at and perhaps recommend favorably, with the exception of on page 3 in line 36, strike 50% in the WMM and substitute 55% in the WMM. That would just be a strike through.
So moved.
We need a motion to rescind.
Can we just make a new motion that overrules that one, overrides?
Motion to
We
reconsider.
need a motion to reconsider.
Okay, I make a motion.
Well, wait a minute. Did we take them? I thought we took no position on 2.
You recommended unfavorably, and the vote was 2-1. You were in the opposition.
So that we need a motion to reconsider Amendment 2.
So moved.
It's been moved.
I'll second it, but I'm kind of curious as to why.
Well, it would be to move the newly amended Amendment 2, which would be 50% instead of 50. It would be 50% instead of 55.
So in other words, strike this amendment on page 3, line 36?
Correct.
And the amendment on page 4, line 2, which makes category 2 10% as opposed to 5%?
No, I don't think, no, because that's a broad.
Well, if we cap it at 50%, it doesn't matter what the individual
Okay, all right.
percentages
But
are.
I am going to come back because I think, but we'll do that one.
Okay, so the motion on the floor now is to give a favor. Did we vote on the?
No, the motion on the floor is the reconsider.
The reconsider. So all in favor of reconsidering Amendment 2, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Now, I'll entertain a motion to approve Amendment 2.
With the,
As
The
revised.
new amended version of Alderwoman Tierney's amendment.
And
So
are
moved.
you only doing the 55 to 50?
right.
Just strike the line. Strike the line that
Just
on
strike
page
that whole
3.
line.
Strike the whole line.
Was that a second, Alderman? Okay, further discussion? Hearing none, seeing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Okay, so that takes us to Amendment 10. Arnett,
Yes, Madam Chair.
Alderman Arnett, sorry.
So this starts on page 7 and goes all the way through page 10. In the amendment as submitted, it recommended striking out all of the detail in the use table and instead putting the detail into definitions. I like the details going into definitions, but first of all, the task force agreed that each of the maritime districts were different, and this is where the differences can show up. Now, I admit there are very few places where they are different. If you go to page 8 and you go to number 2 on land storage, there's differences by maritime zones, but I think that this would now make this part of the use table even different from the section B of the maritime uses, which does go through and have detail, and it would make it different from all the other use categories in Title 21. And I don't understand the purpose for it, but I think that it is useful to be able to go to these use tables and say, look at maritime services and see the kinds of things that are delineated under maritime services. And just as an example below it, maritime retail has footnotes associated with 2 of the maritime districts. So I'm not sure what we gain by doing these strikeouts, and it just seems to me like it would make the ordinance simpler to not make these changes to the code.
I'm going to ask Dr. Nash to respond.
Right, well, with all due respect, when I look at the maritime use table for maritime uses, I find it very confusing, and I have been looking at it for 15 years. I don't understand why in WMI you can't have a dock, slip, pier, and other facility at which boats are berthed only in conjunction with other maritime uses under in-water boat storage, but you can in WMM, whereas why can't you have docks, slips, piers, other facilities of which boats are berthed in conjunction with other maritime uses, not in WMC, but then you can have it in WMI. This makes no sense to me. So my idea after, and I got the idea, I would say, from Mr. Lomax and the Maritime Advisory Board, who raised the question, why would there be a maritime use not allowed in a maritime zoning district? And that made sense to me. All of the maritime uses should be allowed in all of the maritime districts. That's why they're maritime districts. And for us to this granular level, nitpick, well, here you can have equipment, storage, and display, but here you can't. You know, it's just hard to rationalize for someone who's looking at the code, trying to figure out, like, well, what's the use they want to do? Like, which of these billions of categories does it fit into? For us, it's a lot easier to administer if we say, okay, you want to do on-land boat storage? Okay, great, go ahead. And what is on-land boat storage? Oh, okay, well then I'll look in the definitions and I'll say, okay, that includes open areas, paved or unpaved. It includes structures existing as of August 1987. You know, okay, I got it, we're good to go. We'll sign off on your use and occupancy certificate. So that was the justification for trying to simplify this section of the use table.
So, if I may, Madam Chair, when Mr. Lomax and I went through this and we talked about it and we started looking at the differences, you're right, some of the differences don't make sense, but they got into the code, and it seems to me that it would be appropriate to try to reconcile the differences across these categories rather than just throw them out. And that's why I have some concerns about taking this level of detail out without actually going through the exercise of trying to understand why the differences. There may be some valid reasons for differences across districts. So that's the reason for the offering of this amendment.
We don't have a motion on the floor.
I move Amendment 10.
You're favorable?
Favorable, yes.
I'll second for the sake of discussion, but I've found myself wanting to respect the director's comments on this. They seemed reasonable to me, so
I have to agree that the alderman, or not the alderman, but the director has use of this. And it should be to the advantage of the user as to be able to find the information that's needed to do their work. So, further discussion? Alderwoman Tierney?
As Alderman Arnett was quoted in the newspaper, we want our code to be enforceable. So I would just add that Dr. Nash's comments be respected on this. It needs to be simple and enforceable and not so specific.
Thank you. Okay, further discussion? Hearing none. All in favor of giving giving a favorable recommendation to number 10, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Aye. So amendment.
That's two ayes and a no.
Because you said aye.
Sorry. Yes, I oppose. Okay, Amendment 11, Alderman Arnett.
So Amendment 11, since we're now heavily dependent upon the definitions section to discuss this, I felt that it was important to add definitions for pump out stations and for sailmakers, because those are clearly maritime activities, and so those would be put into Title 2172, the definitions section.
Okay, is that a motion?
I move that we vote favorably on Amendment 11.
Is there a second?
second.
Further discussion? I think we just heard the justification. Further discussion? Seeing none. Alderman Savage?
So is the justification, is there any, can you say that again?
So these are maritime uses. They're
Yeah.
not in the maritime use table, so I wanted to put them, we can put them in the table too, but definitely put them in the definition section so that when we're adjudicating maritime uses, we know how we're defining these things.
Okay, further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of Amendment 11, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, Amendment 11 passed. Amendment 12, Alderman Schendelmeyer.
Wait a minute, we gotta
Thank you,
find
Madam Chair.
different pieces of paper.
I'm sorry?
Excuse me.
Oh, I'm trying to find my papers.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Didn't know if I was interrupting. Alrighty, so Amendment 12 is to, one, shrink the boatyard size trigger from 20,000 square feet to 5,000 square feet, which I think can include some of our smaller maritime properties instead of the larger ones as part of the task force's goals. And this it lets them be able to actually play with on this legislation. The other goals are to add some different triggers, such as reduce the size of the boat lift, where currently we have a 30-ton requirement, and this one simply adds a travel boat lift or a crane. And it also adds public water access as a trigger to qualify for this legislation as a whole. And the public water access is defined per the incentive and per in our code.
Do I hear a motion on Amendment 12?
Chairman Finlayson, if
There seems to be quite a bit of information in this amendment. I'll ask my committee members, what's your pleasure? Or
Well, I'm not inclined to support, but before I discuss it, I mean, I'm willing to make a motion, but I'm not at this point. I want to hear more from the task force, but would you like me to make a motion just to get on the?
yeah, to get it on the floor, that would be
Okay,
great.
I'll move a favorable recommendation.
I'll second that to get it on the floor.
Okay.
I think
So,
it's-
discussion. Committee first. Are you not ready to discuss, or would you like to hear? Mr. Dales is here, the committee's here.
Well, I mean, my similar concerns I've had about some of the other big changes, this goes against the consensus that was put together. And I know my understanding is there was a lot of discussion about the size of, these, not triggers, I guess is the wrong word to use, we already used that, but the size of the boat storage, but also the equipment on there for boats. So that's really why I'm hesitant. These all end up being very significant changes.
Alderman Arnett, and then we'll go to Alderman Shannon.
So I believe that Mr. Dales, and he has some people that he's representing. I agree with Alderman Savage. These are very significant changes, and I worry that there are unknown, potentially unintended consequences. But I would also argue we're so radical in my view, what we're doing already with the legislation, and this has not been discussed before anybody, certainly not before the task force, certainly not before the Planning Commission. And I'm open to it, but I would say that if we're going to accept these, I would strongly argue that the whole piece of legislation has to go back to the Planning Commission. It probably should go back to review before the task force. And that's fine with me too, but that isn't going to happen in this term. So I think we really have an awful lot of understanding to come to what the impacts of this would be. I've heard some say that this would be potentially deleterious to the maritime industry. I can't make that claim myself, but I would certainly like to hear discussion about that. But I think first, my preference would be to hear from the people that would be affected and benefited by this change.
Well, I have every intention of calling on everyone who wants to weigh in. I defer to the committee first, and then the alderman, and then I will call on others who are here. Alderman Shannemeyer?
Thank you, Madam Chair. These are not radical changes. These simply allow smaller maritime properties to have an opportunity to benefit from this task force legislation that currently are shut out by the bill as written. And I wanted to add the public water access as a trigger as well, as we've covered in a couple other amendments. We need to expand out how we viewed maritime back in the 20th century and start looking at how we're viewing it in the 21st century. And public water access and allowing our population a fair way to get to the water and giving these properties the incentive to provide it is a key access point to it. We've talked about public water access being an important issue in this city for years, and by pushing these forward, we can provide incentives to our maritime businesses to actually offer it to our residents.
Thank you. Mr. Dales?
Thank you, Chair Finlayson. First, I just wanted to provide some clarification on this amendment. It may look like a lot of information, but it's essentially just modifying these triggers in each place that they occur in the bill. So it's a lot of repeat of the same thing, just to reduce the threshold for the size of these triggers at each place that they occur. And as has been noted, these are intended to allow small property owners who can't provide the very demanding high threshold triggers that have been in existence for the last 30 years to also have some flexibility to allow a smaller percentage on smaller properties of non-maritime. I would argue that what we are proposing in the full bill is very good, but is having some serious and significant changes to allow larger properties that are providing these triggers to have a relatively higher level of non-maritime percentage, which I fully support and think is the right thing and well needed after 30 years. What these do will have much less impact in that only 25% of properties that are 10,000, 5,000 square feet may be used for non-maritime. So we're talking about much smaller amounts of our city maritime being transferred to non-maritime for smaller properties that right now and for the last 30 years have had no such flexibility. I've got some people here with me today who own maritime properties in Eastport, both in the WME district, which is the one that would be most benefited by this change. One is Cole Alsop, who owns Muller Marine and North Sales. Both are on small parcels and provide real contribution to maritime uses in the city. And then I also have Seth Lehner here with me, who owns Horn Point Marina, which is a smaller property that also won't be able to provide the triggers as they've been for 30 years and as they would continue to exist here. The logic that we've heard from the task force is that this non-maritime flexibility is offered only to those large properties that provide infrastructure that all of maritime industry is dependent on. What we would ask is that the committee and then the full council consider that the flexibility needed is equally needed by these smaller properties that in their own incremental way also support maritime. Muller Marine is available for people who have small boat repair needs that you can't get necessarily at the larger properties. It is in bad need of help, and I think that their testimony will help the committee understand why that's needed. What they would gain in return for providing this maritime use in the city is proportionate to the smaller amount that they offer. So they offer a smaller amount of maritime, but they also would gain only a small amount of non-maritime. So I'd like you to hear from them before I add any more comments on this, but I think this amendment does much less to change our maritime industry and maritime environment than what the ordinance does. And the ordinance is great. This is just allowing the smaller properties who have not had the ability to gain anything to finally have some of that same flexibility, and they'll help you understand why they need it. So if I can just step aside for a moment and let them speak, I'll do that.
Would you please give us your name and address, please?
Yeah, Cole Alsop, 317 Chester Avenue. Thank you, Chair and Alderman, everybody here. Thanks, Phil. I just wanted to just touch briefly on, obviously this amendment. The magnitude of the change is really not that large, and I can probably give you some specific numbers around that. If you look at that peninsula right there on the map, the businesses that really gain a benefit from having these triggers at these levels, there's about 9 properties, right? So if we add a couple more properties in there, even though the verbiage in the legislation seems like it's significant, is it really that significant of a change? It's really not a big peninsula. I mean, we know exactly who is benefiting and who's not benefiting from this legislation. Our properties, we have Muller Marine, which is a hard maritime use. They're hauling boats, painting bottoms, doing fiberglass work. We have a sail loft there. We have North Sails. During COVID, when a lot of the maritime industry was benefiting from a surge of participation in recreational boating, the competitive sailing industry really struggled because everyone has to get together with a bunch of strangers, fly somewhere, and go get on a boat and race. Well, they were doing really poorly while the rest of the maritime industry was doing well. So our small property lacks diversification in the tenants that we can have. These larger properties, they have a much more diversified tenant base within the maritime industry. If you give them an additional 50% and us nothing, it's really a competitive advantage for those larger properties, and it can be a little bit tough on us. Not a little bit, a lot. All we're asking for is a tiny little bit of non-maritime use That will help subsidize the maritime use. It's really not a lot of additional properties. I mean, we just have, if we were to go from 0% to 25%, that would allow us to add one little tiny office in our small office building to have non-maritime, a little bit more diverse tenant base there, which would be really meaningful for us. The last point that I'll make on this is just that, we are still a very capital-intensive, hard maritime use property. We have capital-intensive operations. We have to replace our docks. We have to take care of our facilities, just like the larger players. We have a much smaller office space, but that office space is not far from the WMM properties, and we compete directly with the office space on the WMM properties. There's just not enough maritime use to go around. We're just asking for a tiny little bit of flexibility, 25%, which is half of what's being granted to the large, big players that have a seat at the table right now where we don't. Thank you.
Can we ask
Thank
questions?
you. Questions?
Yep, please.
Alderman
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Arnett?
So, when you say a small office space, do you have an approximation, if this were to pass, how big the office space you would be adding would be?
We have a 800 square foot office space on the first floor of our building that was previously rented to a yacht broker. As you guys know now, yacht brokers really don't need that office space. They've got a cell phone, they've got a car, they can do their job. If we were able to rent that to any other tenant, it would be really meaningful for us.
So this is on the bottom of North Sales?
Exactly.
Yeah. If this were to pass, would you be allowed to have a restaurant there?
I would defer to Phil on that question.
Alderman Arnett, one of the other amendments would contemplate that, but this amendment, changing the triggers itself, would not specifically allow for a restaurant, except as you guys have just amended it, so that WME currently, I think as amended, could do a 2,000-foot restaurant with special exception if they provide these amended triggers in this Amendment 12.
Thank you. And are there differences, and Phil, you might want to stay, is there differences in parking requirements for a non-maritime office space than your current maritime office space?
There are currently in the code, I believe it's part of the larger bill to change the overly burdensome parking requirement for professional office and maritime to make it equal with that in other parts of the city.
But currently, and particularly with Muller, you don't have any parking spaces. Do you have shared parking arrangements?
Well, we're glad you brought that up, and this would be my question probably for the committee and for everybody here. As part of Muller, we have a small marina there, and it would behoove us in a lot of ways to get rid of Muller Marine as a tenant and just provide parking to the dock space where people keep their boats there. My question to all the boaters around here is, do you want to pass legislation that incentivizes us to get rid of Muller Marine? Or do you want to provide incentive for those hard maritime uses that we're alleging to support here?
I'll give you my answer. I have been boating intensively for 50 years, and I have rarely ever gotten maritime services from any place other than Muller Marine and North Sales. So I would not want to pass legislation that would get rid of Muller Marine.
Well, reducing the triggers would incentivize us to retain that hard maritime use.
Thank you.
Mr. Dales, was there someone else that would like to speak on this?
I just thought that Alderman Savage and Alderman Shinner may have questions for either me or for Mr. Alsop on this amendment, so I'd wait right now to see if that's the case.
Alderman Chenemeyer?
I was just going to comment about parking and how, look what happens when
You
we...
still want to talk about parking?
I always want to talk about parking. Just saying, look what happens when we have these parking requirements that are pseudoscience. We might have to tear down buildings.
We want services for boat, not services for parking.
Yeah. That's all I have to say.
Thank you.
I do believe Alderman Savage had that.
Alderman?
Well, I'll wait until after the testimony. I'll wait until after the testimony because I have some
Okay.
general questions.
I would suggest Mr. Lehner then come provide his testimony.
Good afternoon, Seth Lehner. My address is 105 Eastern Avenue, 21403. And I want to absolutely support what Cole just said. We also see the same trend over the last decades. This is not something that just started recently. This is not just something that started since the beginning of this legislation period or this task force, et cetera. The quality of the tenant for an office space or a commercial space has dramatically changed over the last several years, even over the last several months, most especially since the COVID. Cole eloquently brought that up. You know, we have fewer and fewer people regularly using a commercial space for the intent and use of an office. Frankly, we need all of the help that we can get to keep our space occupied with people who can pay rent, who can buy the services that a WME property would provide, both slip rental, both, excuse me, both commercial space and everything else that you've listed in these task force findings. What is poignant is that when we change the percentage use of that space and allow a more general use for one zoning versus another, it truly handcuffs the party that does not see that percentage or delta change. And what Cole and I, along with the other WME property stakeholders, are very concerned about is that we are left literally behind and in a struggling position. And I think that that's quite concerning. I do believe the intent of this group in this room is to rise the tide for all of us. Sorry for the euphemism, but it happens to be true here. I think that your intent is to make it bring us into this decade and beyond, but I am quite concerned that for smaller properties such as mine and ours, it is going to be a handcuff scenario when we go to find uses and tenancy for existing structures. And that's my concern.
Thank you.
I think that's all of our testimony on this particular amendment, except that I would ask, I would speak to a comment that was, I think, made by one of the committee members, and that's that it may not have been that this was fully considered by the task force. I know that these several small maritime owners wanted to be very involved, and if you want to know from them, they could tell you how well they felt represented or whether they were able to be involved. And for better or worse, I don't think that this particular argument this particular amendment was considered enough. And so with that in mind, please remember the scale that we're talking about and asking for these adjustments to what is, again, I fully support and think is a great justification for the bill in front of you. When we're talking about a 100,000 square foot building, 50% means 50,000 square feet. When we're talking about a 5,000 square foot building, like for Cole, we're talking about 1,250 square feet. We're talking about 15,000 square feet for Mr. Lehner, and again, 15% is nominal compared to the 50,000 square feet that you're thinking about with the larger properties. So just please remember scale, and please remember that these are minor adjustments to what was a good outcome from the task force, but may not have captured a very important issue for these smaller property owners.
Thank you. Further, Ms. Fogarty?
Yes, there are really three issues, and I'd also like the others here with us to address those issues as well. The first is the city and the planning department have worked amazingly to have a land use process in place that is the process dictated by the state of Maryland, and that was first to bring forward an adopted plan. The Maritime Task Force strategy is a land use strategy. That plan is adopted. From that plan flows the ordinance. There is nothing in any of the amendments that the Rules Committee or Alderman Tierney or the mayor have introduced, or the Planning Commission, that is not completely consistent with the adopted plan. So you have the plan, which has been adopted by council. Now you have an ordinance which implements the plan. There was a consensus, which was very, very hard fought. A great amount of the discussion had to do on the task force with the triggers. And without, well, what I would say is both the residents and several of the maritime industry tradespeople were very specifically opposed at this point in time, which does not mean in a year or so when we have new data, because we're going to be evaluating this annually, in opening the triggers. There was an extensive discussion about changing the triggers, reducing the triggers, opening it up. There certainly was sympathy for some of the smaller sites, but it was felt that at this point in time, the purpose was to support the land-intensive larger sites. Those are the sites that create the hub. To maintain those triggers, the only trigger that there was agreement to add was a fuel dock. There was very specific discussion not to open it up further, and there was also discussion that after there is data within a year or so, to then look at whether this is something that would go to a broader approach. So with that said, the amendments are not consistent with the plan. They're not consistent in any way with the deliberations. They are certainly something that and I will let Sally take this, that the department can look into in the next year. Sally.
Alderwoman Tierney.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think what needs to be explained is and Eileen might need to speak again, as far as the objective of these triggers. The testimony I heard, it was almost like the businesses or the yards were being, punished because they had triggers, and, they get more than us because they have triggers. Well, the triggers are the essence of the maritime industry. And the objective of this whole study and of forming the task force was to protect maritime use, and it has been depleted. So the task force wants to optimize the use of those triggers, and yes, incentivize non-maritime where those triggers are substantial. I just want to make sure that the framework of these triggers is, the concept of them is understood. I mean, this is, again, the essence of the maritime industry. Secondary to that is office use, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think that was, when the task force came together, and I know this again because I've had 3 constituents on the task force, there was much discussion on looking at the whole maritime landscape, including these small, viable businesses. And with that, it was decided, they settled on this additional magic number of 15% of non-maritime use in exchange for a property keeping these triggers. This was a collaborative effort, understanding the whole landscape, but not losing the essence of maritime. If we start looking at independent office spaces and all, I just think that would negate the purpose of this legislation. And that's more of an opinion, but I see nodded heads.
Thank you, Alderwoman.
Thank you.
Alderman Savage, and then.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, and I want to thank you for coming out to testify. I do think, and I think it's safe to say that everyone here wants to work on this in the future to make sure that we can help out as much as we can the small maritime properties. But this legislation itself, I think to my colleagues' remarks, but also Ms. Fogarty, we went through this extensive process to establish consensus on what we have. And unfortunately, the way these amendments are written, it really significantly undermines that in the sense that these changes would apply to all of zoning, all of the maritime zone and all the properties. This wouldn't just apply to the smaller properties. I think if we look at this in the future, we should probably have two different tiers of triggers, one for smaller properties and another for larger, because we can't pass this as written because it would undermine the entire fabric of this legislation. And they are very substantive changes, because you're talking about going from a working boatyard down from 20,000 feet to 5,000. You're talking about any size lift or crane. You're talking about seafood processing going from 9,000 to 5,000. On-land boat storage from 25,000 down to 5,000, and then a whole other slew of new triggers. So that's substantive. I mean, I'm open to discussing this in the future when we revisit this legislation, but this it throws everything out, all the effort that we had. And I mean, not to mention there are other much more substantive changes in the other amendments, but I can't support this at this time. It's just, I think we need to stick with the substantive proposals from the task force.
Alderman Finlayson and Alderman Savage, I'd have a response for the several comments that have been made by Ms. Fogarty, Alderman Tierney, Alderman Savage, if I may. So first, I'd like the committee and then the full council to understand that there is absolutely nothing procedurally or legally that would prevent you from adopting these amendments. The suggestion that there is a legal requirement to move forward as the task force specifically did with their report and then the ordinance does not at all preclude you from adopting these amendments. Second, the argument against these amendments that relates to the procedure that the task force used should not stop you from considering these. When we say that the task force considered very carefully, strongly, whether or not the triggers should change, that discussion was very much set by who was in the room and who's at the table at the time. If someone had been there from this group of property owners to say the triggers should be adjusted for the reasons that you've just heard, that discussion may not have gone the same way. And I'll let them speak for themselves as to whether they felt that they were able to be a part of that conversation or whether they were represented in that conversation, or whether they have an understanding of how the discussion went after the presentations that were available on video. So I'll leave that to them, but please don't feel as though the procedure the task force used should be a reason not to consider adjustments to it. Please don't feel that there's a legal reason that you can't adopt these amendments. And then lastly, to Alderman Savage's point, I think he raises a very good point about this amendment, something that I think would have been considered and raised if we had had this on the table earlier. And that is reducing these triggers for all properties may not make sense. These are definitely intended to help only the smaller property owners. And so what I would suggest with this amendment is that perhaps it's not going to be ruled on by this committee or there's not a recommendation for it or not. The full council meets on this and considers amendments on the 25th. Based on what Alderman Savage has suggested, I would re-propose this amendment and perhaps someone would introduce it as revised so that these triggers that have just reduced the size of the things that must be provided are only available for properties under a certain size. But of course, the intent here is not to enable large properties to provide lesser boatyards or to enable large properties to reduce the size of their lifts or cranes. But it's to enable properties like Muller to benefit and not have to wait for maybe doing this again at some point in the future, which we all know could be years and years. I mean, it's nice to say we'd like to take it up again, but that is a very big unknown. So with that in mind, I would take to heart Alderman Savage's suggestion. And if you would like to consider this amendment again now, as with each paragraph on the 3 pages that is this amendment, simply representing a new set of triggers only applicable to properties under 60,000 square feet, I think that would be one way to consider this amendment. On the other hand, I understand if you can't recommend for or against on that now, and we would simply put it in again after this committee and have it in front of the full council without this committee having weighed in. With that, I would ask for the opportunity for Mr. Alsop and Mr. Lehner to talk about whether they would have contributed to the conversation about triggers and perhaps influenced it significantly.
Alderman Arnett?
I'll defer to Mr. Waldman, but I will defer to Mr. Waldman, but I have a couple of comments.
The Planning Commission was quite sensitive to the interests of business and to the interests of residents. And we spent 3 work sessions with the task force. We had extensive discussions during those 3 sessions, and then we spent another two sessions hearing testimony and discussing and coming to conclusions, and then we spent yet a 3rd formal session going over findings. So there's been an awful lot of time that the Planning Commission devoted to this, as well as all of the other people around here who devoted time to this. I would say that the commission would be quite receptive in the future to getting answers to some of the following questions. How many properties would be affected? What kinds of advantages would these properties be able to take of a changed incentive trigger system? What would be the situation with restaurants? What would be the situation with events? What actually would adding public access as a major triggering event, what effect would that have? These are just some of the few concrete questions which I think deserve being raised and later deserve being answered, but I don't know the answers to those questions at the moment. One of the real attractions of the legislation as proposed is this idea of annually reviewing what's going on. I think that you have people on the council, on this council and on the coming council, who are receptive to the hard work that would be involved in amending legislation in the future. And the Planning Commission would, of course, spend all of the time that would be required to go over that and to have a full hearing and then be able to report to the council.
Mr. Waldman, you mentioned that the Planning Commission heard this legislation at least 3 times, or more. Were there ever questions about the smaller minority marinas businesses, maritime businesses?
No. Mr. Dales attempted to present a comment, but it came in after noon on the day that we were deciding things, on the 2nd session of public hearings. So just to repeat or to clarify, we had 3 work sessions from the task force as they were going through what it is that their goals, their strategies, their information, all of that. And then we had the public hearing sessions, which took place over 2.5 times.
So you had no opportunity to really delve into what might have been left out of that task force report?
We did not have the opportunity, but I mean, I can't speak for other people, but I would say that had the proposals come in early and been fleshed out, clarified, and we could have gotten information, perhaps we could have given you a response specifically as to the smaller owners. And I can only say that we will be receptive in the future to hearing and working with legislation. And I think that, like I said, I don't want to repeat myself, but one of the real attractions to this legislation is this idea that we can look at it year after year as we get information. And it's meant to be a work in progress.
Well, I know how often we come back and revisit things that we approve.
Mistakes that we've
not. Thank you. Alderman Arnett.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'm glad I waited until Mr. Waldman made his comments, and I would say that, and I told you earlier that I'm a habitual user of Muller Marine, so it's close to my heart. But I think that at this last moment, we had, 9 months of the task force meeting, and it was interleaved with meetings with the Planning Commission. And there was a lot of debate, a lot of discussions. This 50% versus 55, which I hope we'll get back to in a minute, came up frequently. The triggers came up frequently, and so on. I heard, I think from Mr. Alsop, something that struck a responsive chord with me, which is that they're feeling some of the same pangs that the WMM is feeling in terms of a changing clientele and people who are interested in using maritime office space. And I am sympathetic to that, and I hear it here. But these changes, you may label them as not very large. I think they're very big, and I think that there are huge potentials for unintended consequences in my neighborhood. And they have had no public hearing. They have not been reviewed by the Planning Commission. And I think they should get both. But that's not going to happen by the 25th of October. So I would submit to the council, we really have a decision to make. We have something that has been very thoroughly vetted, different levels of comfort amongst us all for what is before us. But quite frankly, I think, and from my perspective, I'm very close to being ready to vote on 02521, and particularly if I can get a couple more amendments, vote favorably. But I'm not ready to vote on these now. I'd like to hear, I haven't heard a peep from my community, and that's where the WME is, about this, because they haven't seen it. And we just can't, at the last minute, throw major things like this in the hopper. I think we're doing some major things as we go on with the legislation as submitted, but to not have public hearing, not have any vetting by, I would think these kinds of amendments should go back to something, maybe not the same people on the task force because they worked long and hard and they may never want to see maritime again, but to a body like that, and certainly to the Planning Commission to be vetted and help us think about what this would do. Much of the angst that I am getting from my constituents, I admit, is the specter of what could go wrong rather than the reality of what likely is to go on. But that has been pretty thoroughly vetted through the process we have. We haven't vetted these things at all. And I do think they should be vetted, but I don't think we have the time to do it now.
Alderman, you have proposed that this legislation wasn't ready for prime time, period. So I'm kind of miffed that we're where we are. But anyway, Alderman Heddlemeyer, I think you were next.
Thank you. Look, I think the changing the purpose and the goals of this legislation based on Amendment 12 is overstated. It is simply a way to welcome these smaller properties to the table. They have felt like they have not been able to get access to it. And this also helps address a massive issue that we're having with public water access in our city. And by adding that as a trigger, we can get out of a 20th century, what does it mean to be maritime mindset, away from the traditional wooden boats and working seafood yards, things that aren't really being done in our city anymore, into something that can build a more vibrant, flexible, adaptive waterfront communities for all of us. So I would argue that this is not a... Am I doing the thing where I don't talk into the mic again?
Yeah.
Cool.
Too tall.
Yeah. And this is just a way to get out of the 20th century hard and fat, like hard, you must do this and this and this rules, and get us more into how do we build a more flexible, vibrant, adaptive waterfront community for all of the properties. And I will say, and I think you nailed it when you said that we don't really revisit things here. We, I think, do these big initiatives and then let it lie for a while, and I admire the lift that our commission has done. I really do. It's been a lot of work. I think at the bill as written, I put my name on it because I think it's dramatically better than what we previously had. But this is something that can improve it, increase that flexibility for a more vibrant waterfront property.
Chairman Finlayson. Oh, sorry. It's Alderman Savage.
Alderman Savage?
Yeah, just, I mean, in terms of revisiting things, we do. I mean, the ADU legislation we've tried that twice. Forest Conservation Act, we've had a number, even going back a few terms. I've got a piece of legislation tweaking that, even though we just passed something a few years back. So that's not a problem. And plus, we're going to both most likely be back, at least some of us for sure are going to be back on the council. And I'm happy to, but we have it built in to look at things every year. So it's built in that we will be revisiting this, no question. But, you know, again, I mean, this changes things for all the zones, maritime districts, no matter the size of the business. This changes it for everybody, not just the smaller. So this really does, just like I said, upsets the cart here. It puts an enormous speed bump on this maritime cart going down the road here. It's going to upset it. You know, because these have not been brought to any of the other stakeholders. All the people on this task force, how many total in the report? We'd have to redo the strategic plan. We'd have to go back to the Planning Commission, the Maritime Advisory Board. This bypasses that. And I feel like that is fundamentally, in many ways, just not democratic for something this substantive. All these are very substantive, and I think we just need to. No, I think we should focus on some of the smaller changes and tweaks that have gone through the process. We have all these amendments from Tierney that have gone through the process. This is just, no, I feel like we should just cut it off and not even go forward with these at all.
Okay, Chairman Finlayson, there was a procedural objection raised.
Excuse me, Mr. Dale, I'm calling on Mr.
I just want to clarify, there are provisions in the amendments to revisit this in the future. So, I mean, that's built into this as well. I believe it is Amendment 1 that we passed, approved already, so.
And I'm sorry I left out planning and zoning in that list.
Yeah, but I also want to just expand on what Alderman Arnett said and what Ms. Fogarty said, that the consensus I witnessed on this task force was really grounded in the large sites being the anchors for what we have here today. They were, you know, originally protected in '87. To the extent that we are a hub in the region, the Atlantic, the East Coast, it's because of those sites. To Alderman Arnett's point about his ward, a key dynamic is the perspective of the residents, and they are strongly, they have a strong aversion to non-maritime in the city and in their neighborhood. To the extent that we were able to get what we got was through a lot of debate and discussion among the task force members, and I think that just needs to be clear here.
Alderman Channemeyer and then Mr. Dale.
I will leave this as my last thing. Look, these commissions and boards do tend to get dominated by people who have the time and energy and resources. And that leans towards maintaining the status quo. And what I think is going to happen with this is by giving the flexibility to the big dogs and not to the smaller properties, we end up pushing them out more and more. And Amendment 12 is a good way to just help level that playing field, help things be more adaptive and change. I have nothing against large properties. I have nothing against the fantastic work done by our task force, but by removing that flexibility for small properties and giving it to bigger ones, we keep that status quo where the people with the most time and resources get the best say and the best outcome. And I'll leave all my comments at that. And yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Dales?
Chairman Finlayson, the first procedural issue that was raised was more of a technical one, and that there wasn't a public hearing for these amendments. The public hearing requirement is for any substantive change. Virtually all of the amendments 1 through 9 are substantive changes. It's not substantial, it's substantive. and that rule is either suspended or like all the time. I think these amendments are no more substantive than the existing ones, and they can certainly be included. Now, with regard to the issue of whether we should ask the smaller property owners to wait, I think that will be their testimony about their involvement in the procedure, I think will be important to that issue, and we should hear from them. On the other issue of whether these amendments have been supported and considered in the light of certain data, what I need to say about that is where this ordinance is supposed to help maritime businesses, it's the way it's doing that, and as we all know, is providing non-maritime to certain properties, which I absolutely agree will be better for the maritime industry and maritime businesses to improve the maritime environment in those larger properties. What we don't have, with all due respect to the task force and its work, is a lot of data on that. There's not a lot of data from the task force on how many properties would be affected by the existing changes to the existing triggers or to the changes to the existing non-maritime flexibility. We tried to provide some of that data in the AMPS group letter that suggested or proposed how many properties were likely to be affected by the ordinance as introduced. So I think you have no more or less data with regard to this amendment as you do to the full ordinance. Again, I think what we're asking for here is exactly what you already know about. You already know the effects of allowing non-maritime where triggers are provided. If these triggers are only provided to smaller properties, the effects will be exactly the same, except much, much lesser in scale. We're talking about 1,250 square feet instead of 50,000. And there's only, a few properties of these smaller properties that are going to be able to provide the triggers as written here. So it's a much lower impact, but exactly the same impact as you've already been considering and debating. It just changes and expands who can benefit at a very small scale. And it's really important to those people. So with that, I'll stop my testimony on Amendment 12 and just ask for the opportunity for the two business owners to speak to their experience of the process and their reaction to the request that they should wait and hope for revisiting this in a year.
Thank you. I think we as a council have been remiss in our responsibility. Again, yep, absolutely again. When we allow any legislation that is not totally inclusive, that bothers me greatly. No matter what the industry, that bothers me. We accepted a report and we appreciate it and we understand and have a great appreciation for all the work that went into that report, but it did leave some people out. Whether that was by design, necessity, convenience, whatever, whenever a group is left out of a body, that's a problem. And we don't know what the unintended consequences are for any of the organizations that are impacted. But we didn't do our job, sitting up here, to ask the right questions. And I contend the Planning Commission didn't ask all the right questions either. So here we are now trying to fix a gap in what was and is a good task force recommendation and thus legislation. And I contend there may be still a way. Because if I was Mr. Schandelmeyer, I would be working on an amendment for the full body that would create a second tier that would not impact what has been done, but to create a second tier for those folks who were left out. So that's what I propose for you. So the motion on the floor is to, I believe it's to oppose. Do we have a motion? We don't have a motion. No, we do. We do.
It was recommended favorably.
Oh, it was recommended favorably. It was moved favorably, correct.
Moved and second.
And seconded. So I will call the question now. All in favor of Amendment 12, please say aye. Aye. Oppose?
No.
Okay. Thank you very much. Alderman Schandelmeyer, Amendment 13 is also yours.
Yep. A lot of fun. I just enjoy complicating up the process. Amendment 13 will expand the professional office space floor area in WMI and WME from 15% to 25% when combined with the triggers. This is, again, as I will be mentioning a whole lot, to increase the overall flexibility of these spaces. I think when you take away flexibility and dictate through rules that I just fundamentally consider somewhat arbitrary, it ends up causing these problems and hurting these properties overall down the line, and can lead to them not being able to function to the degree that we know that they can.
Alderman Arnett, would you like to make a motion?
Yes, I move that the committee recommend unfavorably for many of the same reasons that were raised before, but if we were having a hard time accepting 15%, moving to 25% is clearly a radical departure. There's one more part of this legislation that has slipped in on the last sentence, which has to do with residential uses do not count towards building on the lot for the calculation. That may be a good thing, it may not, but I think that needs a heck of a lot of deliberation. And it does seem to me that it even further waters down the availability of maritime space for maritime uses. So I move we recommend unfavorably.
Second.
Alderman Chenoweth?
Look, for office space, it doesn't exactly matter what's in that space. It's an office. We can give these businesses and buildings the flexibility of use so they can actually thrive and stay open, because we are losing what we had previously seen as the bread and butter of our maritime industry in the 20th century. And by maintaining a rigid structure that I still think is in place, even with the 15%, we lock these buildings into a 20th century mindset when we need to be thinking of ways to start expanding them out and making them more resilient. So.
Thank you. Alderman Savage?
Unless I'm mistaken, the whole purpose of the maritime zoning is to make sure that some of that office space is reserved, the majority in this case, for maritime uses. I mean, if you want to just open it up to any use, then it's not maritime, it's just a regular commercial zone. But this legislation, the zone was put in place for that very reason, is because they saw a problem with maritime offices and space just disappearing in this city, unless I'm mistaken. That was one of the original intentions.
Could I give a very
Alderman
quick response
Chedemar.
to that? I appreciate that issue, but I think we've already kind of had a loose wiggle room with our interpretation of what is a maritime office. In the past, we were calling the EPA maritime, which, kind of, if you look at it through the corner of your eye and like in the dark, we could do that. But I think adding flexibility to these things is good. It adds resiliency to these properties and lets them stay in operation.
A quick comment on that, because I worked in the office. It's not just the EPA. It was EPA, NOAA, Fish and Wildlife Service, because they were all underneath that umbrella of the Chesapeake Bay program, which is absolutely maritime. It wasn't just EPA doing their regular EPA stuff. It was specifically for a maritime purpose. That's why. I just want to clarify.
I'm not sure about that, being on LGAG, but that's okay. Okay. Alderwoman Tierney?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just, again, and I do, with very much respect and due respect, I do take exception to what you said about the council not doing their job. I followed this task force. They had how many meetings, and there was ample opportunity for participation, and the study does address the gentleman that did testify today. If you read the study and the economics that went into it, specifically page 32, page 33.
Alderwoman, are you referring to Amendment 13?
I am, and as far as the value of maritime office space versus non-maritime office space and all the challenges that they have, that was addressed in the report. And I just want to call attention to the maritime study and how much emphasis, and somebody spoke of not having data. Market Economics 2013, City of Annapolis Maritime Industry Economic Survey, City of Annapolis Maritime Industry Economic Survey, November 2013. There's a ton of data that went into this, and I just don't want to dismiss that. And that does tie into this amendment as far as the office space rent, maritime versus non-maritime, and how it was considered.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, may I follow up on that?
Alderman?
So there is even newer data that was not considered by the task force, both the Bureau of Economic Analysis data and the SAGE study, which was specific to Anne Arundel County. And they also report a robust maritime industry. But they note, and this is an important thing, it's a very cyclical industry. It cycles with the economy writ large. So just because we're healthy now doesn't mean that we shouldn't be thinking about changes in the legislation to allow flexibility to deal with when things are down. So, but the work was data driven. I wish we had used the even newer data, but still it was data driven.
Alderman Shannemeyer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do want to say I never intended to imply that our task force or our colleagues or the Planning Commission had not considered the economics of this. I am just coming at this from a very big, the more flexibility we give to these properties, the more potential for resiliency that they have. So that is where this is coming from.
Mr. Dales.
All right, Chairman Finlayson, somebody raised that comment was me, and I wasn't referring to there being no data. It's the simple analysis of how many properties will be directly affected by the changes made in the ordinance, and we tried to offer some of that data. I don't think there's any more of that data present for what's in front of you in the ordinance with the amendments you've recommended versus the amendments that the amendment considered in 13 that we've moved on from. With that said, with 14, which is what we're on now, there's not a lot to say. This is just an amendment about scale, where we're talking about 50% for WMM. We're just saying here, we're trying to increase the fairness of the maritime zoning so that it affects them in a little bit closer to the same way. It'll still be much, much better for one zone than the other two. But here we're just closing that gap just a little bit. And that's all this is. It's just a matter of whether the council people think the 10% is fair. Again, there wasn't specific analysis about the effect of 15% on these various properties that would affect then the maritime economy, and it's certainly not for the smaller properties. So I don't want to add a lot of testimony, but I do know that Mr. Alsop would like to address the committee if you'd like to hear from him.
Madam Chair, can I get a point of clarification? I thought we were on Amendment 13.
13 is one.
Oh, okay, I thought you said 14.
Yeah, we are on 13.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Alsop?
Yeah, thank you. I would just want to add that I didn't mean to imply that we didn't appreciate how much consensus building there was. We really do appreciate it, know how hard that is in politics. Just felt a little left out. The other thing that, I would argue is that any data from 2013 can safely be put in the trash after COVID. So who knows? The other thing is we could have just, I don't know if there's a slide on this deck, but you can just point, we could just make a list of the properties that benefit and don't benefit from this. And that would have been helpful data. I mean, really, it would have. I attended all the Planning Commission meetings online. There was a lot gone through, sort of like the inequity was never addressed. The last point I'd like to make is that moving from 15% to 25% of zero doesn't really matter, right? If none of the properties in WME that are relevant that have office space can get 10% more, if they don't meet the triggers to begin with, who cares? What this does, it really helps us from WME. If there is a way where we can tweak some triggers in the future or maybe do some little things, just having 10% more office space, I mean, for me, that's probably less than 1,000 square feet. If I move 1,000 square feet from a yacht broker to an insurance company, and the parking's the same, everything else is the same. Is it really that extreme of a motion? I just don't think it is. But it pays the mortgage for me. And I appreciate that the residents would like to really have all maritime uses, but the residents do not pay the mortgage. So we've got some more things to consider and probably some more data to gather. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a motion on the floor to give an unfavorable recommendation to Amendment 13. Is there further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of the position to oppose, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, aye. All right.
Amendment
The word is
14.
nay. Okay, I've been corrected. The word is nay. I couldn't come up with that word. Okay, Amendment 14, Alderman Schandelmeyer.
Amendment 14, it has the changes to the triggers that I put forward in Amendment 12. So just that is adding to some of the text. But the big thing that will be in discussion for this is with those triggers in place, trigger standards in place, it would allow WME to have restaurants at 4,000 square feet instead of 2,000 square feet. This is one, a flexibility issue again. Two, I find the 2,000 square foot in this one property and the 4,000 square foot in the other properties arbitrary. And then finally, I have worked in restaurants since I was 24. While you can do a successful restaurant with indoor dining service in 2,000 square feet, it is a lot more difficult and requires a lot more creative of placement and requires a lot smaller of a commercial kitchen, limiting some of the things that you can offer. Larger restaurant spaces have that flexibility for full-scale commercial kitchen, full-scale dining service indoors, and allow a more comfortable dining experience for everyone.
Thank you. Is there a motion? Alderman Arnett?
I move we recommend unfavorably.
Second.
Okay, further discussion.
Yes.
Mr. Dales, I'm sorry, Alderman.
Yes, so this one, every one of these amendments has some nuances to it. First of all, speaking to this amendment, the Mr. Dales and Alderman Sandemeyer are correct. The front part of this, the amendment for page 15, line G, is the same as all the other ones. And again, I don't have a problem with those per se, except that they have not been vetted. They have not gone through a public process in any way. I guarantee you that not one of my constituents even knows about these amendments, let alone have had public hearing, have had it vetted by the Planning Commission. So I think that those are problematic. I think there's some problems specifically in here, looking again on the first page under F, sailing clubs. I think we really need to have that much better defined to understand it. But going down to the new J and adding a 4,000 square foot restaurant in the WME, and adding rooftop dining on top of it. And I've already heard people complaining about noise from restaurants across the water from inside the restaurant. Adding a rooftop dining with no really particularly strong qualifications for that is really a flashing red light. Again, and I do question whether in most of the properties, there's the parking for a 4,000 square foot restaurant, which raises a whole nother issue. But I think it's worth considering this. I think that it is something that should be evaluated through a regular, routine, rigorous, and open process. But these have not been put through that kind of process, and I think they should be. And if we want to delay all of the legislation in order to put these through the ringer too, that's fine, but I don't think we can accept these at the 11th hour without having a rigorous public comment process. So I would not be receptive to Amendment 14.
Alderman Schandelmeyer.
Amendment F is the same as the triggers listed on the vote as written. in the triggers as written. I just want to point that one thing out. Again,
Are you referring to F in the original legislation is not in this amendment?
hold on.
This only refers to G and new J, correct?
So this is on Amendment 14, but it is also the same on Amendment 12 because it's basically just the exact same thing. The yacht and sailing club providing in and on water boat landing. That is listed as one of the triggers in the bill as currently written. If you want a specific reference, if you go to page 15, line 17. So that's not changing anything on that front. As for the overall size of the restaurant, this again, it was a very arbitrary decision. I think if we're talking parking requirements for a 4,000 square foot restaurant as well, I've been very vocal on my view that the parking requirements that we've set up are a pseudoscience that we don't really back up with any real data, and they're arbitrary, and it's led to large underused parking lots of impervious surfaces. So getting away from my views on that, by giving increased flexibility for things such as rooftop dining, people live in and near these mixed-use neighborhoods. These are going to be things that occur on a daily basis. And trying to limit something that we've, in one area that we've allowed in others, does come across as awfully unfair. And I have, again, worked in restaurants for years. I'm very familiar with working in a restaurant space of around 2,000 square feet, and I'm aware of working in a restaurant space of around 4,000 square feet. And I've seen what commercial kitchens or dining areas are able to do with those various space limitations. You have to compromise on a commercial kitchen or get creative on a commercial kitchen on these smaller properties that you have a lot more flexibility and ability for the final business as it is larger.
May I make a comment?
Alderman.
The original boatyard, which by all measures was successful, was less than 2,000 square feet.
What was that?
The original boatyard restaurant.
Oh, okay.
And the current boatyard restaurant, with the addition of the market, is significantly less than 4,000 square feet. We know what kind of business they do and what kind of traffic and parking they generate. And that is, you don't live in this area. I do, and you can call us 20th century thinking, but we have to live with this day in and day out. And so all of this legislation is trying to find a balance. You're right, we do need to progress. We need to be thinking about this in a holistic way. But part about thinking about this is the impact on the people that have to live with it. And these things, particularly things like rooftop dining, are really hot button issues. And again, I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. What I'm saying is we need to have a proper hearing process, having this vetted, allowing the people who are affected by it the opportunity to opine in public before at least the Planning Commission and with a public hearing before the City Council. And that's not happening. So we have not had, as we have had with the rest of the legislation, a very open, lengthy process that has been collaborative with everybody. People have had the opportunity to speak. They have not had that opportunity with these. So I am not objecting so much to the substance of these resolutions as I am to the lack of process. There has to be that open process so that people can weigh in. If they choose not to weigh in, fine, you gave them the opportunity, but that opportunity has not been granted.
I need clarification on this amendment. Alderman Schandelmeyer. It appears that what is added, especially under new J, all of what's in this amendment is in the original legislation, except for the adding of and rooftop.
It also increases the size of the restaurant space.
Okay, that's in the previous section, so, but you've taken much of what's already in the legislation
Yes.
as part of your amendment, which is unnecessary. So all you needed to do was to add and rooftop to that, to line, what is it?
I'm an extra person. What can I say?
Okay, well, I just wanted to be clear because we're debating it as if all of that is not already in the legislation. If we pass this legislation, the outdoor dining and all of that is already in this legislation.
Yes. Again, and I have been upfront about on the top part of Amendment 14, it does match the same triggers as the
Okay,
previous
I just want to be
Amendment 12.
clear on.
Yep.
Alderwoman Tierney?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Specifically on the restaurant expansion request from 2,000 to 4,000, I'm going to say this without any political filters, but that's nothing more than spot zoning. I mean, it's very clear that there's a request for one restaurant to be larger than 2,000 square foot, and I'm not a believer in changing the code or implementing new code for just one situation. We learned that the hard way at 110 Compromise Street. So I think we have to look at the broader impact of what that does in the code for every maritime zone. I just think you need to consider the intent of this and what the consequences would be, whether intended or unintended.
Thank you. Alderman Schnellmeyer?
I will
I'm sorry?
Sorry, I was making a face at Takia because I wasn't speaking into the mic
Missed it,
again.
sorry.
And she's fussed at me about that the past 48 hours a lot. The current limit is a bit of spot zoning itself because we've allowed it on these other properties and we've just forced it on this one specific area to be the smaller space. This is just a way to even out the playing field.
Thank you. Mr. Dales?
Thank you. I would agree with Alderman Schnellmeyer that this is the opposite of spot zoning. This applies the same standards to an entire district that's being differentiated from its neighbor district without any real basis. It certainly doesn't apply to any specific property. Now, moving on from the idea that this possibly could be spot zoning, the way this amendment was initially proposed, the only thing that was done was to strike the specific WME provisions from the subject to standards 2164 and to just add the words WME to the WMM section. So basically to make the rules the same for WME as they are for WMM. And that's again, there's not a lot to say on this amendment because all that we're seeking here is equity, parity across WME and WMM. The notion that we shouldn't do that because Boatyard is of sufficient size at 2,000 feet and then later at 4,000 is a non sequitur. There is no reason that WMM should be able to do 4,000 square feet and WME should not. So basically everything in Amendment 14, before we get to paragraph J3, relates to creating that parity, just making the standards the same between WME and WMM. The justification in the task force presentations was that WMM and WME are very different, and they aren't. I think a lot of people would be hard pressed to tell you where WME begins and WMM ends. The nature of the properties on the WMM may be larger, but they are all equally proximate to residential uses. They have the same basic mix of uses in the districts. So there's no reason for saying that one should be able to do 4,000 and the other shouldn't. That's the politics. That is about a certain property, and I don't think you should legislate that way. The next change that we're offering here is that, and this actually goes to Alderman Savage's comment on the First Amendment we discussed, which I believe is now number 12. This amendment was in case the triggers aren't changed to allow for small properties to benefit here. This would say that for properties that meet the requirements of A and B, which are for sites that are less than 60,000 square feet, and where the restaurant use would not be more than 25% of the total GFA, that the restaurant use in WME could occur without special exception and in the same way that it can occur in its neighboring districts. That would allow the smaller properties to benefit. And again, if we're talking about a 5,000 square foot property, 25% is never going to get them to 4,000. This is about those smaller restaurants that may be able to exist at 1,200 square feet. To allow those small uses to provide a little bit of extra cash flow that help to improve the properties for the maritime tenants. So part 3 is distinct from the rest of it, but the rest of it was really just adding WME into the WMM section and deleting the specific WME section for the subject to standards. There isn't a good justification in my mind, and I don't think that I've heard one from the task force yet as to why WME really should be treated differently. I think everybody knows why it is being treated differently, and I don't think that's right.
I'm going to offer apologies right now. I was just notified that staff has to leave in 5 minutes, so this meeting is going to have to adjourn, and we're going to have to call another special meeting. So it is what it is. Can we finish? Alderman, we're still in session. Have we progressed enough on Amendment 14 to take a vote?
I believe so.
Okay. Hearing no further discussion on 14, all in favor, please say aye.
And by favor,
This is in favor of opposing.
recommending unfavorably.
Yes.
Aye.
Aye.
Nay? That would be a nay. Okay. All right, so we will pick up at our next meeting. It will be an evening meeting. And we'll begin with Amendment 15 and go from there. Thank you all for your patience and your sturdiness to sit through these lengthy meetings. We appreciate it. Adjourn. I will entertain a motion.
Motion, we adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Please say aye. This meeting's adjourned.